So writing accessible HTML. This is lesson 1. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at a few things. To start off, I want to ask a few questions. The first one being, do you have a computer? You may be sitting at one at school. You may be using a friend's computer, but my question is, do you have one personally? Secondly, do you have a place where you can work on that computer? Something set aside, a desk or a workspace where you can actually work on it. Third, do you have access to the internet from that computer? Or is it a computer set up somewhere where you can work on it but doesn't have something connected to it? That will be important for you to have internet connection at the computer where you'll be doing work to write accessible HTML for the purposes of things that we'll be discussing in the later lessons. To be able to validate your code, for example, with some of the tools available later on, you will need to have the ability to connect to the internet, upload your files, and run some scans from the internet. And lastly, do you know how to download and install software on that computer? Kind of a prerequisite to being able to download is connection to the internet. So that's the reason why that question is fourth. Okay, so introductions and prerequisite questions are out of the way. So let's start off with HTML is the most powerful thing in the world. I want you to think about that for a second. Why that might be. You might be asking yourself, what does that mean? Well, to explain, example, Facebook, a website built on the foundation of HTML, has over 2 billion monthly active users, making it the most populous group of people in the world doing a single thing. That's measurable anyway. Like everybody eats, obviously, but eating is not a location or a thing that people go and do together globally. Facebook is. The population of China is only 1.379 billion by comparison as of the last World Census information that's available. All right, so let's move on to a definition of HTML. Well, first, it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's an acronym, HTML, and so that right there is what it stands for. It is not a programming language. HTML is a markup language. Markup language which provides you with the elements, tags, and attributes to mark up your content with a structure that clarifies the purpose and meaning of the information. So we'll discuss elements, tags, and attributes later. The term used to identify this outcome or this meaning is semantics. Now, one quote I found online about semantics, the definition of it is that semantics is the branch of linguistics and logic that is concerned with meaning. Well, let's look at the origins of HTML. It was originally proposed in 1989 by Sir Timothy Berners-Lee at CERN, CERN being the European Organization for Nuclear Research. It was created as a way to exchange meaningful or semantically structured information between research scientists and the systems through which they would transfer that information. Now, CERN is one of the world's most largest and most well-respected centers for scientific research in the world. So it was at CERN where Sir Timothy Berners-Lee developed HTML and a number of other technologies that HTML is used upon in order to be delivered back and forth across the internet. And the internet existed for decades prior. So for example, when you look at HTML, it's basically an odd-looking text document. You have a number of elements on here that if you're not familiar with HTML, you might not know what they mean. We will be going through them bit by bit, item by item, and explaining what their purpose is, their use, their meaning in the HTML document, and how to modify them or make them serve your purpose as you create your own HTML. So when your HTML document is viewed in a web browser, it sees this text here that you see. This markup, or this semantically structured meaning, is then rendered or converted by the web browser into a more readable and identifiable set of content. So this content here on the left, the H1 tags and P tags, which we'll be talking about later, are then turned into what we see visually on the page, more readable and identifiable. So what's the process by which that happens? Well, let's look at the anatomy of a web request. The following steps are taken during a web request. So the user, that'd be you or I, opens a web browser application on their computer. So in this case, let's say Firefox. It's one of the browsers available for all operating systems. The user then enters a web address into their browser, like google.com or something similar, and presses enter to send their request from their computer using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, that's that portion of the web address. That HTTP request, basically the web address sent from a web browser, reaches the web server. Now, aside from HTTP, we're not going to get into the networking technologies that sit behind HTTP that are required to make this happen, to get the request from your computer to the web server. That's another industry. But the web server formulates a request in the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, sends it to the web server where the files for the website are stored. The web server processes that request and serves an HTML page back to the web browser that made the request on the user's computer. And then the user is able to read the displayed HTML page. So that's really the process that is gone through in order for a website or web page to be viewed by an individual user. From the user to the web browser, to the server, back to the browser, and back to the user.